Order. 1 week from today, the world will mark International Women's Day. This is an occasion not only to celebrate the critical role women and girls play in families, communities, and societies across the globe, but to also reflect on how those societies can better protect the fundamental human rights of women and girls. Governments that fail to treat women equally prevent their countries from reaching their full potential. Those that empower women in political, social, and economic life are more prosperous and peaceful. Over 70 years ago, Mao Zedong acknowledged the importance of women in Chinese society with his famous statement that women hold up half the sky. Yet, as this commission fulfills its mandate to monitor human rights in China, we continue to find a mixed picture when it comes to the status of women. While the Chinese government implements laws and regulations intended to address persistent issues related to gender-based violence, discrimination, and harassment, women face significant challenges in all of these areas. In recent months, several high-profile cases shined a bright spotlight on the vulnerability of women to violence. In November, tennis star Peng Shuai accused a senior Chinese Communist Party official of sexual assault. In January, a video appeared showing a rural woman, reportedly the mother of 8, chained by her neck in an outdoor shed, sparking serious concerns about human trafficking, the impact of policies of population control, and the treatment of persons with mental disorders. These stories come on the heels of other cases of domestic violence and workplace harassment that reinvigorated the Me Too movement, as well as horrifying reports of rape committed against Uyghur women in intrusive homestay programs and mass internment camps. A brave survivor of these camps will tell her story to us today. While many of these reports generated intense interest within China, the Chinese Communist Party worked to suppress them and stifle expression related to women's rights, just as it constricts freedom of expression in civil society more broadly. It's been 7 years since China jailed 5 female activists for publicizing sexual harassment on public transportation, and feminists, that is, advocates for improving the condition of women in China, continue to be denied the space to speak up, to organize, as demonstrated by the coordination of online attacks and the shutdown of feminist social media accounts last spring. In political life, women are excluded from positions of power, with not a single woman serving on the Politburo Standing Committee, and only 1 woman serving on the 25-member Politburo, and few women serving at senior levels of county, municipal, and provincial governments. Many of the most egregious abuses deny the fundamental freedom for families to decide if, when, and how to have children. Forced sterilizations and forced abortions, such as those prompted for years by the one-child policy and those reported in recent years by the Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims, are atrocities. The move to a 3-child policy raises the specter of a new coercive tools and tactics denying freedom. This all adds up to a complex landscape for women's rights in China, deserving close scrutiny through today's hearing. This is the first time the Congressional-Executive Commission on China has held a hearing dedicated to this set of issues, and it shouldn't be the last. I look forward to our witnesses helping us understand ways we can better stand up for women in China. Now recognize Congressman McGovern for his opening remarks.
Well, thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing on the future of women in China, Me Too, censorship, and gender inequality. I am proud that this is the Commission's first ever hearing, specifically on the status of women. It is timely, given the spotlight on the Peng Shuai case of sexual assault and cover-up, and changes in the party's policy on gender. Since 2005, the Commission has included a standalone section on status of women in its annual report. That initial entry found that while the Chinese Constitution and laws provide for equal rights for women, in reality, they have fewer employment opportunities than men, and their educational levels fall below those of men. Today, we find this dynamic much the same. The Chinese government continues to implement laws and regulations aimed at equality. For example, in January of 2021, a specific definition of sexual harassment was codified in the Civil Code, creating liability for employers and detailing the kinds of conduct that would fall under the definition of sexual harassment. But in their everyday experience, women continue to face discrimination in employment, education, wages, and legal redress. Last September, authorities detained Sophie Wang Shui-Chen and Wang Jianbing, advocates of the China's Me Too movement, under the charge of incitement of subversion of state power. Why in the world would advocating for women's rights be considered a crime against the state? Repression of women has also been documented in the Commission's population control section on the Chinese government's heavy-handed policies to limit births, including the human rights abuses of forced abortion and forced sterilization. We have monitored these horrific practices as part of the government's campaign against Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslim women, and we will hear testimony from a survivor today. For others in the People's Republic of China, however, these population policies are evolving as authorities respond to the social and economic consequences of demographic changes. We would like to know where these policies are headed and whether Chinese authorities' heavy-handed approach will manifest itself in a different way. I welcome the witnesses, and I look forward to your testimonies. And again, I want to thank Chairman Merkley for coordinating this hearing. I think it is long overdue. With that, I yield back my time.
Congressman Smith now wishes to deliver some opening comments. Congressman.
Chairman, and thank you for convening today's important hearing. I'd like to concentrate my remarks on the most coercive, horrific, and systematic abuse of women's rights by the Chinese Communist Party. For decades, the women of China were subjected to the brutal one-child per couple policy, under which countless numbers of women were forcibly aborted and sterilized against their will. I chaired dozens of hearings, including as chairman of this commission and my subcommittee on human rights and the Foreign Affairs Committee on this egregious abuse, and heard directly from many women who were forcibly aborted. I would note parenthetically, I led the successful effort to reverse a Clinton administration policy that denied asylum to those who are fleeing forced abortion, and also offered an amendment back in 1985 that is still the law, that we will not contribute to any organization that supports or co-manages a coercive population control program. That was back in '85. The trauma of being abducted and forcibly brought to an abortionist by police and family planning cadres has few parallels in the world. At one of my congressional hearings I chaired in 2009, for example, a Chinese college student named Wu Jian said that she was brought to a hospital against her will, and she testified that, and I quote her in part, "As soon as I was taken out of the van, I saw hundreds of pregnant moms there, all of them just like pigs in the slaughterhouse. The room was full of moms who had just gone through a forced abortion. Some moms were crying, some moms were screaming, and one mom was rolling on the floor in unbearable pain. Then it was my turn. It was the end of the world for me," she said. "When the surgery was finished, the nurse showed me part of my baby's bloody foot with her tweezers," close quote. As I think members of our, who will be testifying today, members of our commission know, the girl child in particular was targeted in the womb, given the cultural preference for boys. If only one child or two or even three was allowed, it was the girl who was exterminated, something we all called and call gendercide. This has led to the world's most significant gender imbalance anywhere in history. According to the Congressional Research Service, as of 2021, there was a reported 689 females and 723 males in China, leading to, quote, the world's most skewed sex ratio at birth, with 111 males for every 100 females per the 2020 data. This has only been partially ameliorated by the CCP's belated recognition that they have created a demographic time bomb And the change to a 2-child per policy in 2015 and now a 3-child per policy as of last year. The coercive hand of the state is nonetheless still present. Indeed, this commission conducted a series of hearings following the adoption of the 2-child per couple policy. The conclusions drawn from those hearings was that the 2-child policy should not be lauded because it did not change the basic structure of coercive population control in China, and it appears the same is true for the 3-child per couple policy. The policy still violates international human rights norms. Women in China still endure coercive pregnancy monitoring, fines, and the immense psychological burden of enforced birth limits. At least as of 2017, China was the only country in the world where the female suicide rate is higher than the male. Experts differ on the exact number, but estimates indicated that between 25 and 40% more women killed themselves each year through suicide than men. That doesn't happen anywhere in the world. A contributing factor has been the coercive power to destroy their children while in utero. Let us not forget the bureaucracy that has been created, mobilized, and invested in population control. The new policy does not dismantle the brutal machinery of enforcement, nor does it remove the pernicious incentives given to local officials to pressure mothers to abort a child if the birth hasn't been approved by the state. And even if the situation has ameliorated somewhat for women from the ethnic Han Chinese majority, the CCP's ruthless antinatalism is still played out with a vengeance, as we all know, Mr. Chairman, in genocidal policies aimed at reducing Central Asian populations, including the Uyghur minority and others, the Kazakhs and the Kyrgyz. Last year, an independent tribunal in the United Kingdom, chaired by Jeffrey Nice, who led the prosecution of former Serbian President Slobodan Milosevic to determine whether the CCP's policies amounted to genocide. One of the witnesses, named Razi, presented testimony regarding how she was forcibly aborted and told a similar story that I have heard since 1983, when I first started my effort to combat this heinous abuse of women's rights. A female OBGYN named Dr. Gafour told how if a household had more births than allowed, they would raze the home, they would flatten the house and destroy it. I also had at one of my hearings a woman who we were able to get out of the country, who ran a family planning program in Fujian province. Her self-description was, by day, I was a monster, by night, a wife and mother of only one, and that she would have women in their 8th and 9th pregnancy pleading with her to allow them to carry their baby to term. But she said with resoluteness, we would abort each and every one of them. Let me just conclude by pointing out that one of our hearings, and you know this, Mr. Chairman, it was our commission. We did hear from Marigold Turson, who recounted her ordeal of torture, abuse, and detention in the Chinese camps. We've heard from many others over time. We know, as we all know, Xi Jinping is continuing his genocide. And let me just say, I asked repeatedly during the Obama administration and even the Bush administration, as the author of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act and 4 other laws to combat human trafficking, that what is the linkage between forced abortion, the gender side of the girl child, and trafficking? And finally, the TIP report, Trafficking Versus Report, recognized that not only is there a linkage, it is one of the reasons why so many women are being trafficked into China, because of the dearth, the lack of women and the girl child who have been exterminated as a result of this horrible policy. So thank you again for calling this hearing. I think we have to be very clear that this is not over, despite what Xi Jinping and others might have said. The machinery of the forced abortion policy remains intact, and that is cause for great, great concern. Yield back, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Congressman. I'd now like to introduce our panel of witnesses, starting with Dr. Leta Hong Fincher. She is a journalist and author of Betraying Big Brother, The Feminist Awakening in China, as well as Leftover Women, The Resurgence of Gender Inequality in China. She is an adjunct professor at Columbia University's Department of East Asian Language and Cultures. She won the Society of Professional Journalists Sigma Delta Chi Award for her China reporting. Aaron Halegua is a lawyer and research fellow at New York University Law School Center for Labor and Employment Law and the U.S. Asia Law Institute. In 2021, he authored the report, Workplace Gender-Based Harassment and Violence in China, Harmonizing Domestic Law and Practice with International Standards. He has worked on labor rights issues for nearly 20 years, including consulting on labor issues in China, Thailand, Burma, Malaysia, and Mexico. Mei Fong is Chief Communications Officer at Human Rights Watch and a former Pulitzer Prize-winning Wall Street Journal China correspondent. Her book, One Child, The Story of China's Most Radical Experiment, won a nonfiction award from the American Society of Journalists and Authors. Foreign Policy magazine named her to its top 50 list of U.S.-China influencers. She was previously Director of Communications and Strategy at the Center for Public Integrity. And Tursunai Zaiwudin is a survivor of the Chinese government's mass internment camps in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. As one of the very few survivors of these camps who has reached safety in another country, she has provided testimony to human rights groups, to researchers and journalists investigating the genocide against Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims. Her brave voice exposed to the world the sheer depravity of the mass internment camps and their horrific treatment of women. We will now hear directly from our witnesses, starting with Dr. Hong Fincher.
Chairman Merkley, Chairman McGovern, and distinguished members of the Commission, thank you for holding this important and timely hearing and inviting me to testify. While the entire world watches Russia's horrifying invasion of Ukraine, the Chinese government refuses to call Russia's actions an invasion. President Xi Jinping appears to be aligning himself with Vladimir Putin, further undermining the rules-based international order. There are many reasons that China's communist regime has survived for over 70 years, in spite of the collapse of communism in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. But it is impossible to understand the longevity of China's Communist Party without recognizing the patriarchal underpinnings of its authoritarianism. In short, Xi Jinping views patriarchal authoritarianism and the subjugation of women as critical for the survival of the Communist Party. China's economy has entered a protracted slowdown, just as the country is beginning to face the demographic crisis of an aging population, falling birth rates, and a shrinking workforce. In response, the government has revived sexist elements of Confucianism, upholding the male-dominated family as the basic foundation of a strong nation. State propaganda praises Xi Jinping's traditional, quote, family values and presents him as the father of the Chinese nation in a, quote, family state under heaven, in which obedient wives and mothers in the home are key to solving China's most pressing social problems. China's propaganda apparatus began a crass campaign in 2007 to stigmatize single, educated Han Chinese women in their late 20s, mocking them as, quote, leftover women, to push them into marrying and having babies for the good of the nation. This pro-marriage, pro-natalist propaganda has only become more intense with the adoption of a two-child policy in 2016 and the three-child policy last summer. China's population planning policies also have a strong undertone of eugenics. Even as officials urge Han Chinese women to marry and get pregnant in order to, quote, upgrade population quality, they are slashing birth rates among ethnic minority women, in particular Uyghur women and other Turkic women in Xinjiang, with forced sterilizations and abortions, as witness Tursunai Zaiwudin will describe in her testimony. The government is carrying out a sweeping crackdown on feminist activists who pose a unique challenge to China's all-male rulers. As a result, the Me Too movement against sexual violence has been the target of aggressive censorship. Take the heavy-handed reaction to Chinese tennis star Peng Shuai's Weibo post last November 2nd, accusing China's former Vice Premier Zhang Gaoli of sexual assault. Peng Shuai's post was deleted within half an hour, and she herself disappeared for weeks, only to reemerge in a series of undoubtedly coerced appearances coinciding with Beijing's Winter Olympics. We are about to mark the 7th anniversary of the Chinese government's jailing of 5 women's rights activists in March 2015 for planning to commemorate International Women's Day by handing out stickers against sexual harassment on subways and buses. Since then, feminist activists have tapped into the broad discontent felt by Chinese women and developed a level of influence that is highly unusual for any social movement in China since 1989. Even though the government persecutes activists, shuts down women's rights and LGBTQ rights centers, and censors feminist social media content, China's feminist networks have actually grown in recent years instead of being wiped out. The shrinking space for civil society in China makes it even more extraordinary that a feminist movement is able to survive at all. While prominent male human rights activists have emerged over the years, very few Chinese citizens knew about them or could relate to their abstract goals. By contrast, feminist activists today take up causes that have broad resonance with young women and LGBTQ people across China. Issues such as sexual violence, intimate partner violence, and gender discrimination. China is an autocracy with no press freedom, no internet freedom or freedom of assembly, and effectively no rule of law. Yet when feminist activists organize around issues that affect the personal lives of millions of ordinary women, even the all-powerful male-dominated Chinese Communist Party struggles to quash the movement. Thank you again for inviting me to testify.
Thank you. And we'll now turn to Mr. Halegua.
Chairman Merkley, Co-Chair McGovern, and members of the Commission, good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to testify before you on this important topic. I was asked to address the subject of sexual harassment in China. My testimony draws upon my nearly 20 years of studying Chinese labor issues. Last summer, I published a report on workplace gender-based violence and harassment in China, which describes the current state of Chinese law and practice, and also makes recommendations to the Chinese government, Chinese employers, and global brands on how to better comply with international standards. The full report is attached to my written testimony. Today, I will share a few high-level findings from my research. And I will start with my basic conclusion. It is my view that, in recent years, China has in fact made important rhetorical commitments and taken some positive legislative steps towards eliminating sexual harassment. However, there has not yet been sufficient action by officials, courts, or employers to realize those commitments. In practice, Chinese women still routinely suffer sexual harassment at work and have little hope of obtaining meaningful redress. In terms of prevalence, like in many countries, sexual harassment remains a serious problem in China. While survey results vary, one study by the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences from the 1990s found that 84% of female workers reported being harassed. So what has been China's response? At the international level, China recently supported the adoption of ILO Convention 190 on the elimination of violence and harassment in the world of work, which seeks to create a zero-tolerance environment for sexual harassment. China even agreed that adopting a convention was preferable to a non-binding resolution. However, since Convention 190 was adopted in 2019, it has not yet been ratified by China. Domestically, China continues to improve its legislation. In 2020, like Congressman McGovern mentioned, China adopted a new civil code that included a provision specifically on sexual harassment. However, while the provision establishes clear liability for individual harassers and requires employers to take measures to prevent sexual harassment, it still does not create any legal liability for employers when they fail to do so. Turning to the implementation of these laws, There is evidence that some Chinese employers are taking sexual harassment more seriously. More employers are adopting sexual harassment policies, and there is a considerable number of court cases involving employees who have been fired after the company found that they engaged in sexual harassment. Far more troubling, though, is the very small number of sexual harassment victims that ever bring a case in court. Only 6 of the 83 sexual harassment court cases decided between 2018 and 2020 involve victims bringing lawsuits against their harassers. Moreover, victims who do sue rarely win, and if they do, the remedies are paltry, sometimes just a few $100s or maybe just an apology. What's worse, sexual harassment victims who complain often face retaliation. It is also common for them to be sued for defamation by the alleged harasser. Indeed, far more cases are brought against sexual harassment victims than by these victims. One female worker who published an online account of being forcibly kissed, groped, and undressed by her supervisor was later ordered to pay the equivalent of $1,800 for hurting the supervisor's feelings. Already, in this culture of silence, very few victims are willing to come forward and complain. If there continues to be little to gain from filing a complaint, but a great deal to lose, it is unlikely that more victims will come forward. So what can be done? In closing, I will just mention a few recommendations from the more comprehensive list in my report. First, the Chinese government should explicitly make employers liable for failing to prevent or address sexual harassment, should modify evidentiary rules that make it difficult for victims to prevail in court, and should protect victims from retaliation and defamation claims. Chinese employers should establish procedures to investigate and resolve complaints, and global brands should ensure Chinese partners have such mechanisms in place. And the U.S. government should commend China for the steps it has taken thus far, but encourage it to do more to harmonize its domestic law and practice with the most recent international standards. Thank you all again for your attention to this important set of issues. I look forward to answering any questions that you have.
Thank you, Mr. Halegua. And now we turn to Ms. Fong.
Thank you very much, Chairman McGovern, Chairman Merkley, and members of the Commission. I appreciate this opportunity to testify on the impact of China's population planning policies and the effect it has had on women in China and beyond. Now, the one-child policy began in 1980. It has shaped China's population planning policies for well over 30 plus years. And then it was replaced in rapid succession with the two-child policy in 2016 and then the three-child policy in 2021. Now, this sudden about change that went from limiting births to boosting births was a result of the ruinous consequences of this inhumane policy. In short, it created a population in China that was very unbalanced. Too male, too old, too few. When I say too male, what do I mean? There are 30 million more men than women in China, and that's about the population of Australia. When I say too old, that means you have a shrinking workforce and you have more retirees in China than you have the population of Western Europe. And so what does this all mean for women in China? Well, Mao may have said that women bear up half the sky, but as far as the one-child policy and the consequences of this, women have borne far more than their share of the burden on this. We'll start with the one-child policy first. As a journalist in the Wall Street Journal, in my years reporting in China, and while researching on the book, I spoke to many women who recounted tales of being forced to have abortions, some as late as 7 months. I spoke to officials who described how they cornered and chased women like prey, pregnant women. And I spoke to many, many mothers who had very heartbreaking stories to tell about being forced into acts of abandonment and infanticide, killing their own children, all to conform with the one-child policy. Now, of course, there's a switch to the 2- and 3-child policy, but even so, these have inflicted new wounds on women. Now, for example, this whole move to boost births in China is done to ask women of China to shore up the shrinking workplace. But they themselves are now being forced to contend with problems in the workplace. Since the introduction of the two-child policy, Human Rights Watch has documented a rise in pregnancy-related discrimination against women in the workplace. Employers now fear that women might take 2 or 3 lots of maternity leave instead of only 1 during the one-child era. And so some companies have sought to avoid this through job ads or interviews or workplace treatment that discriminate against women with no children, women with just 1 child, or simply women in general. Women have been fired for getting pregnant, they've had their pay docked, they've been asked to sign agreements that pledging not to have children. And while such practices are illegal under Chinese law, the enforcement is lax, and redress and compensation so few that these practices largely remain unchecked. Elsewhere as well, while of course it is much easier to use force to prevent women from having children, it does not mean that the Chinese government isn't taking that same approach, stick versus carrot, to try and boost births. And how this is shaping up is in the form of growing curbs on divorce and abortion. These are both human rights abuses. Last month, authorities said it would reduce unplanned pregnancies and abortions among adolescents and single women. Now, this follows tightened overall restrictions on abortion in general that began in 2018. And also, there have been reports of a clampdown on male vasectomies. Now, authorities say these moves are motivated by welfare concerns, but such explanations have been met with both suspicion and, in some cases, derision from the Chinese public, given the state's long history of coercive birth practices. And it's also, of course, important to note at this point that there still continue to be coercive practices for many Uyghurs in China with forced sterilizations and women held in camps, of which we will hear more of in a bit. Last but not least, it is not only the women of China who have borne the brunt of Beijing's population planning policies. The one-child policy has created a huge shortage of women, and hence a surge in bride trafficking in China, as well as from countries across the region, including Myanmar, North Korea, Cambodia, and Pakistan. Human Rights Watch has documented how hundreds of women and girls in Myanmar have been sold to Chinese families for anywhere between $3,000 to $13,000 US. And once purchased, they are pressured to produce babies as quickly as possible. Now, you have heard the case of the woman in chains who was held and forced to bear something like 8 children. This went viral in the weeks before the Beijing Olympics and threatened to derail the feel-good stories of the Olympics. This is a signal or a representation of some of the ongoing concerns with human trafficking. Now, there is a whole host of recommendations that I've submitted in my written recommendations. I won't go into it at detail at this point. I think it's suffice to say at this point that it is almost unimaginable to think that at this point that any government should be in the business of regulating, making, or forcing women to choose how many children they should have. It needs to stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your work and for your testimony. And now we turn to Ms. Tursunai. Delighted to have you and appreciate your willingness to share your knowledge and your experience.
Sizning özünüzün başınızda ötkənlərini biz bilan həm bəhrə olduğunuz üçün rəhmət. Sizə.
Sizlərə rəhmət. Assalamu alaykum. Bugün hörmətli xanımlar, əpəndilər, bugün sizlər bilan görüşkənimə məşədən bək minnətdarman. Həm məş fürsətdə bütün dünyaga özümnən beşdən ötkən zulümlərni həm vətənimdəki qarindaşlarımның beşdən ötüb atqan zulümlərni anlatış fürsətinə erişkənligimdən sizlərdən köp bək minnətdarman.
Assalamu alaykum. I am very thankful that you have given me this opportunity to talk about what I have been through and what has happened to my people. I am very grateful for the opportunity to speak today.
Mening İngilizcem yaxşı bulmalığı üçün Zübeyra xanım mən üçün sizlərə sözləb verdim.
Due to my English skills and due to limited time, now my translator will read my remarks to you. Thank you, Chair Merkley, and thank you, Co-Chair McGovern. I am very grateful for the opportunity to testify and to tell the world about my experience and the experience of Uyghur women. It is painful to speak about my experiences, but I see it as my duty to be the voice for those who are still in the camps and in prison, and those who died in front of my own eyes. I was locked up in camps 2 different times. The mental and the physical torture I have experienced have left deep scars on my heart. I was taken into a camp for the 2nd time in March 2018 and stayed for nearly 1 year. We always lived in fear. We feared beatings if we could not memorize the propaganda lessons correctly. Every day we heard screaming and crying voices. Then it happened to me. Several times the guards took me out of the cell and into an interrogation room, and they beat me. Once they took me out in the middle of the night, along with a young woman in her 20s. In addition to police officers, there was a man in a suit wearing a mask. I don't know where he came from. These men raped the young woman. 3 police officers raped me as well. They were always taking gills. Sometimes they brought a woman back near the point of death. Some of the women disappeared. I saw some bleed to death with my own eyes. Some lost their minds in the camp. Every time I think about these things, my heart feels like it's been sliced with a dagger. My nightmares make me relive that fear every day. I thank the CECC commissioners for speaking out for Uyghur women. We are grateful to Congresswoman Paxton for advocating for Ms. Gulmira Imin. We are very grateful for the resolution condemning genocide and the forced labor bill that passed in December. I ask you to do more. Please do more to accept Uyghur refugees. I came to the US with the help of the US government and the Uyghur Human Rights Project. There are more people like me who managed to escape China, but they are still afraid to speak. Living in neighboring countries, they are still living in fear of being deported to China at any time. Please also investigate what can be done to help Uyghur asylum seekers. I know many Uyghurs who arrived in the US before the crackdown in 2017, which is already 5 years ago, and they still have not received their asylum interview. The US is doing so much because of your great sympathy for the Uyghurs. Can you also investigate why so many Uyghurs are waiting for years for a decision on asylum? I also hope the Congress can do more to help Uyghur torture survivors to get medical care and counseling. My nightmares and the mental anguish are constant. Camp survivors like me need help for our extreme trauma. Other Uyghur Americans are also suffering terrible mental trauma. Finally, I want to ask for more support for human rights groups and Radio Free Asia to do more programs to help women who are victims of the Chinese government's atrocities. For example, I listen to Radio Free Asia Uyghur shows every day. I hope there can be more news stories about women in the genocide and information about how Uyghur women can survive our mental torment. And more stories about the achievements of strong Uyghur and the Kazakh women can help give us inspiration and hope for the future. Thank you again for inviting me.
Thank you so much for your testimony about these conditions. Thank you to all of our witnesses. We're going to turn to a period of questions now. And Ms. Tursinai, let me begin with you. Could you help for those who are seeking to understand your experience, whether the camp you were put into was a strategy by the Chinese government to separate women and prevent them from having children? Was it a strategy for forced labor? Were you forced to labor? And at what point and why did the government release you from the camp?
Hazır sualını Türkçe sizden başlayaydı. Mesela Xitay hükümetininki şu qandaq stratejisi deydi. Bu hükümetinki stratejisi mi deydi? Mesela ayollarni balalardan ayırıydı. Hem onun ayollarni şu hem lagerlarda mecburi emgek selişmiş olanın hemisi. Yani qandaq bir strateji Мен уну мындак стратегия деп утраптан бир нерсе диемеймен, lekin инакла унун ичинде биздин лагердин ичинде көгүнүм аш балы болмаслыкны биринчи орунда койду. Улар аш жокутуш, hatto балыс косогут кеп калганларын түшүрүйтүп шундай кылды. Факат аш жокутушлам немесиде. Шуның үчүн умушу бир уйгурларны бир кыйнаш аш немеси деп ойлоймун мен. Унун башкасын айтпайм. I don't know what kind of strategy that Chinese government wish to implement, but the one thing that I know and it's clear is the Chinese government wants to, for Uyghur women to not have children. They try to, they imposed on sterilization on every woman. Just the main thing that I know that clearly is they want to destroy Uyghur women in different ways. Chet elде туруп атканларым маселен мына муш аялым аштак. Chet elде туруп атканларым мушта арыйт барды бал чакыларды муш аялым балысы азыр бал чакысы Казакстанда өзү ашбеттен да эветмейт. Аштак ар хил жоллар менен бир азаплаш кыйнаш деп ойлойм мен. In different ways, the Chinese government tried to separate the family members. For example, this picture that I am just showing you, this woman was separated from her children. And in different ways, the only thing is that they just try to destroy the Uyghur families and the Uyghur women.
And if you could, at what point were you released from the camp? And I know you were admitted or put into a camp a second time. What was the strategy of the Chinese government? Why were you released?
Xitay hükümeti siz ikinci yani nima qildingiz? Xitay hükümeti sizni nemishga sizni qo'yib atdi jazolarga. To'g'risini ikinci qitim tutib, balki u Xitay hükümetining sizni qo'yib etishidan maqsadi nima va ular qanday siz jazolarga qo'ydi. Men ularning maqsadini bilmayman. Faqat mening bildig'im yo'ldoshim Qozog'istonda bo'lganligi uchun menga guvohlik berdi. Bizning shu to'y xatini ham mening shampanjalarimni ko'tarib chiqib, mening ayolim hech qanday gunohsiz qo'yib atdi butun dunyoga guvohlik bergandan keyin o'zlari olib meni ko'rsatdi video nima bir televizorda mana yo'ldoshim mana sening deb ha dedi. Sen uchun bir nima deb so'zlayapti. Mening yo'ldoshim da shampanjani ko'tarib turib guvohlik beribdi. Shuni ko'rdim o'chaqda. Shu ha dedim chunki mashtaq bu gap qilyotdi butun xalqaro davatdi seni. Undaq deymisan sen deb menga degizdi. Şunu uyaqdı meni qo'yibdi. Shuningdan guvohlik qildim qo'yibdi deb bilmayman hozir men shu ularning nima maqsad qo'yibdi bilmayman. I don't know what purpose the Chinese government has in its mind, but the only thing that I know that because my husband, he was living in Kazakhstan and he advocated for me. I have seen that the Chinese authority, they have showed me that my husband was campaigning for my release from the camp. And he was holding my Chinese ID card and talking about myself and saying that I am innocent and I should be released from the camp. And my understanding is because of my husband and he campaigned for me from Kazakhstan and that's why Chinese government had to release me.
Thank you. No one should ever have to go through what you endured and what other Uyghur and Turkic Muslim women are experiencing. You are a voice for so many, and you're doing a great service by helping shine a light on this inhumanity in this strategy of genocide being conducted by the Chinese government. So thank you. I'm going to turn now to Dr. Fincher, and I was
Sizlarga köp rahmet. Sizlarning har doim bizga yordam berishinglarni umid qilamiz. Har bir bütün vatanimizdagi Uyg'urlarni bütün aşağıdaki zulm tatib atganlar sizlardan umid kutyapti Amerikadan aniq. Chunki sizlarning qo'linglardan keldi deb o'ylayman bizga yordam berish.
Thank you very much. Thank you for giving this opportunity, and our people back home, many people very hopeful that the American government will help us. They are really looking forward and really hopeful that you will support Uyghur people. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Fincher, I was very struck by your description of the patriarchal authoritarian views of Xi Jinping, and that the subjugation of women as critical for the survival of the Communist Party, which is an interesting way to characterize Xi Jinping's views as subjugation is critical for the survival of the party. I do certainly understand your follow-up in which you talk about the elements of Confucianism and the strategy of a male-dominated family and the belief that China will thrive with obedient wives. But why is the subjugation of women critical to the survival of the party? Why do you put it that way?
Thank you for your question, Senator Merkley. It is multifaceted. So the Chinese government faces all of these economic problems, the shrinking of the workforce, aging of the population, the sex ratio imbalance, which is related to a lot of tens of millions more men who are considered to be a grave threat to political stability because they're not able to find wives, domestic violence. The Chinese government passed an anti-domestic violence law in 2016, I believe largely to make itself look like a more responsible global power, but that law has basically not been enforced. And after many years of doing research on women in China, more than a decade, I've come to the conclusion that basically the Chinese government wants the violence against women to continue as long as it is happening within the home. And so it is important for, according to this old Confucian ideology, which is now being resuscitated in Chinese state media today, there is such an emphasis on everybody playing their proper role within the family that is very hierarchical. So there's this aggressive propaganda about how women need to be wives and mothers, very docile and obedient within the home. So women then take over the harmony within the home, and the Communist Party continues to emphasize in its propaganda how a harmonious family is the basic cell of society, that as long as the violence is contained within the home, then that violence is not likely to be directed at the state. So that's one of the ways in which I believe that the subjugation of women is very important. I mean, if you compare China with surrounding countries like Japan, for example, Japan is also highly patriarchal, and yet they've adopted this Abenomics, policy of trying to encourage more women's participation in the workforce, and they've actually succeeded in raising female labor force participation rates. But in China, we see the absolute opposite, where female labor force participation is falling. There is no effort on the part of the government to decrease or reverse that trend in any way. China is the only country, I believe, in the entire world where female labor force participation is falling. And the gender income gap is increasing. And why is it that there is such little female political representation? Not only is it abysmally low, it's actually falling within the Central Committee. There are so many different signs. And the severe crackdown on this extraordinary feminist movement ever since 2015, why is it that China's leaders are so threatened by feminism? It's in large part, because marriage rates are falling, birth rates are falling. Young women today, particularly college-educated young women, do not want to marry or even have one child, let alone two. And so they are, in advocating for the emancipation of women, these feminists are actually posing a real threat to the whole agenda of the Communist Party. And there are many ways in which this basically threatens the ability of China's leaders to control the entire population.
I am now way over my time, which I'm shocked about. How did 7 minutes go by so quickly? I apologize to my colleagues, and we'll turn to Representative McGovern.
Thank you very much. Ms. Fong, you testified that the, and I quote, Chinese states' switch to purportedly pro-natal policies have inflicted new wounds on women, end quote. You recommend that the Chinese government fully respect reproductive rights, to stop regulating women's bodies, and provide free access to safe and legal abortion and contraception. We're all against China's human rights abuses, against its heavy-handed intrusion into the lives and bodies of women. And I think it's important that that we not only publicly oppose China's denial of, I think it's important that when we're talking about opposing China's denial of basic reproductive rights, that we're talking about that whether they are coercive antenatal policies or pronatal policies. The abuse to women, the taking away of women's rights, is the heavy-handed role that the Chinese government is playing and saying, you can do this and you can't do that, or you can do this. Can you expand on your recommendation?
I'm sorry, could you clarify that question?
I guess what I'm trying to say is kind of reemphasize the importance that when we talk about opposing China's heavy-handed approach in dealing with women, that it is important that we are talking about not only their coercive antenatal policies, but also their pronatal policies. And if you could just maybe comment on that.
Yes, I mean, I think China is unusual among many countries. I mean, China is not the only country that is facing, falling birth rates. This is a reality in most modern societies where women are educated and in the workforce and having smaller families and delaying when they start reproducing as they go on and have college. China, however, is unusual in that it is adopting very different tactics from the rest of the world in terms of trying to increase family size. It isn't spending a lot of money on ancillary services like childcare, schooling, all the things that are necessary when you're in the business of promoting equality for women. And promoting equal, parental rights in the workplace. It is unusual in that respect. And I think this goes towards Dr. Hong Finch's point. It isn't so much about births. It is about control. Thank you.
No, I appreciate that. I think it's just important that that point be emphasized, because it is about control. And women should decide whether they want to marry, whether they want to have children, whether they want to have one child or 5 children, whatever.
no children.
Yeah, or no children. That is up to the woman, not up to the government to decide how a woman deals with her life. Mr. Halegua, women or men who suffer sexual harassment or abuse are often burdened with mental trauma from the experience. Does the Chinese system, whether legal or social, provide, psychosocial or other support for those who suffer trauma? Is mental health covered under the Chinese health system or readily available?
Thank you, Congressman. It's not a subject that
Is your mic on? Yeah.
Thank you, Congressman. It's not a subject that I'm particularly expert on. I will say in the legal system, in looking at sexual harassment cases, and part of our study was to analyze every court case we could find that mentions the word sexual harassment. What did become clear in trying to figure out, when courts would actually award damages, for instance, to sexual harassment victims, often required that, they have some kind of psychological evaluation and there be actual documented sort of psychological trauma before they would be willing to award some kind of damages to that victim. In terms of the adequacy of services, from the things I've read, suggests that certainly they're falling short in terms of providing these problems. I think a big piece of it is many people never really want to come out and complain and talk about what happened to them. Right? There's obviously certain stigmas attached to being a victim of sexual harassment, and oftentimes it leads to problems at work. Right? You have become the problem if you complain about sexual harassment, and could lead to problems in one's own family or social groups. The stigma that comes with being someone who complains about sexual harassment. So a lot of people aren't really coming forward and seeking out the help for the trauma that they might have suffered.
Thank you. Dr. Fincher, you testified that China's feminist networks have grown in recent years, despite the overall trend and restrictions on civil society. To what do you attribute this dynamic? Is there a way that those of us outside China can support the movement? And is there a way that we can hurt? Because one of the struggles we always have when it comes to supporting human rights defenders and those struggling for their human rights is, how, despite our best intentions, that we don't do something that makes it more difficult for them.
Thank you for your question, Chairman McGovern. There are many reasons why the feminist movement is so transformative today. So at its core, there's a very radical political feminist movement. Those political activists at the very core are extremely savvy organizers. They're very imaginative. They're located in many different places. It's a rather large community. It has increased significantly since the jailing of the so-called Feminist Five in 2015. And so this core radical base of Chinese feminists is actually part of a global diaspora of Chinese feminists as well, who keep the momentum of the movement going. It is very different from, these isolated, rather, in the past, male heroes who are very well known, but then the Chinese government may kick them out of the country and then they lose all relevance. This is the movement does not rely on a single heroic leader. And it has become the mainstream ideas about just speaking out against widespread sexism and misogyny in Chinese society. It has become so mainstream. These are very popular ideas now. They've caught on among millions and millions of not just young women, but I mean LGBTQ people, young men. There are many allies. So these are ideas that really hundreds of millions of people in China can endorse. And so it's popular. There's a radical core. The activists themselves, the most active feminists, are themselves persecuted. Sometimes they're jailed. Some of them are in jail right now. What can we do to help? Well, Certainly, I would agree as well with Dursane Ziawudun in that the U.S. should do much more to provide a refuge for those fleeing persecution in China. And I know that those who manage to make it to the U.S. still have a lot of difficulty. In fact, I've helped a lot of these people with their visas. They have problems with visas, problems staying here. We can open our doors and welcome more of these people fleeing persecution and help give them the resources they need to make a new life in the US when it is really impossible for them to live back in China. And the thing is that this communication, there's a lot of, because of the internet, of course, there's no internet freedom in China, but the global diaspora of Chinese feminists and Uyghurs, I might add, it has become so large. There's a lot of communication among these people. And so we can provide more resources for those who have fled China, who've come to the US.
Right. Thank you.
Congressman Smith.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our panelists and Tersane, all of our hearts and prayers are for you as you have suffered so much. And this commission and all of us on this panel are absolutely committed to trying to end this genocide and to provide some relief, especially as you pointed out, the mental trauma that you suffer because of your terrible abuse that you suffered at the hands of the Chinese Communist Party. So thank you for having the courage to come and testify, and again, to keep the focus of what Xi Jinping is doing in Xinjiang very much, so that we're all focused on that. So thank you. I'd like to, Mei Fang, appreciate the comments you made about the fact that some 30 million men, frankly, are single. I remember I chaired hearings at which the predictions were being made 15 years ago that by 2020, 20 million men would not be able to find wives because of the extermination of the girl child through sex selection abortion as a direct consequence of the one child per couple policy. So thank you for reminding us of that ongoing terrible debacle that has occurred. And also your point about how the officials, how they chased pregnant women like prey. Again, I have chaired 75 congressional hearings on human rights abuses in China, offered countless number of resolutions and amendments and bills on the issue of forced abortion, always with an idea that there are two victims involved, the mother who is being horribly mistreated and the baby who's being dismembered or killed. I would disagree with you when you talked about abortion protecting unborn children as a human rights abuse on page 2 of your testimony. I believe that, the abuse is when a child is literally dismembered, killed by dismemberment or chemical poisoning. We know more about the magnificent life of an unborn child now than ever before. Ultrasound has shattered the myth that somehow an unborn child is not human and alive. We know that the baby has a wake cycle, grows and develops, and birth is merely an event, just an event, an important one, but an event that happens in the life of a child. So our protections need to extend prior to birth to ensure that these children are not, as I said, dismembered or chemically poisoned. We know that children before birth feel pain at least at 20 weeks, and now the evidence is strongly suggesting that as they're being dismembered, at 15 weeks, they feel that too. And until they are dead, they feel that pain in a most excruciating way. Now, some could just dismiss that or trivialize it or ignore it, but that's a terrible reality. Bernard Nathanson, the founder of NARAL and one of the leading pro-abortionists in the 1970s, he said, "I've come to the agonizing conclusion I've presided over 60,000 deaths." He was the head of the biggest abortion clinic in New York City. And what caused him to change? Dealing with unborn children as patients in need of a blood transfusion and some other kind of benign intervention to enhance their lives, including those with spina bifida. So I disagree with you on that, but I would like to ask you on the issue of sex selection abortion, whether or not you support sex-selected abortion. And I say that because the terrifying impact on China and on Asia continues to be felt to this day. I had a hearing in 2016. I had several hearings. One of them was with Mira Wiesenthal, who said in 2013 that over 160 million missing girls in Asia, 160 million, as a direct result of sex-selected abortion. Almost none of them were killed at birth. They were killed after an ultrasound revealed at about the fifth month, that that child happens to be a girl. And because she is a girl, she is exterminated. 160 million. And then she went on to say that equates with the total number of all the women and girl children living in the United States of America. So every woman you ever see, my dear wife, my daughters, every woman in this country, add them all up. That's how many are missing as a result of sex-selected abortion in Asia. And of course, that's not just China, but it's Asia. But China is missing tens of millions as a direct result. So my first question to you is about sex-selected abortion. Do you support it? I mean, the devastating impact on the girl child. I believe that not only violence against women, but also discrimination against women starts in the womb. If you tell or have a policy, or not you, but a country where the girl child is construed to be less than human and should not continue living simply because she's a girl child, that is a terrible human rights abuse. But I would appreciate your thoughts on that.
Thank you very much for that. And something that you may not know about my personal history is that if there was sex-selective abortion available at the time when I was born, I probably would not be born. I am one of 5 daughters in a very traditional Chinese household. My father was one of 16 out of 18 sons. They clearly cared a lot about sons. So on that position, at least, I certainly see the value of girls, and I certainly see why it is a problem, not just in China, but in many parts of Asia and beyond, where there's been a long patriarchal system valuing boys, and how that has created all sorts of evils and problems, particularly as we see in China with sex-selective abortions and gender imbalances and elsewhere. However, I think also as part of this culture and need to value women, we need to value women's choices. And I will say in short that while it takes a village to raise a child, it does not take a village to determine a woman's choices on how many children she has, if she has children at all, or any of things of those sorts. So those are my thoughts on that perspective. Thank you very much.
I appreciate that. If I could ask you further, if you would, one of the things that I brought out, and again, I go back to 1983 when I first heard about this issue, and I've worked with a number of NGOs. A lot of the NGOs wouldn't do a thing. I remember arguing with Amnesty International for years. Why were they silent on forced abortion in China? There were people in 1985, there was a hearing held right here in the Capitol, at which the argument was, it's all over. The high tides are over. And I said, absolutely not. Then Michael Wiesenthal, Weitzkopf, did a 3-part series for the Washington Post in which he documented the horrific abuse of the one-child per couple policy. And then amendments were offered by me and others that said any group that supports or co-manages it, including the UN Population Fund, should be disqualified from getting funds. We want no complicity whatsoever in this abuse of women and children. But one of the mainstays throughout all of this, besides, again, women being forcibly aborted, was that all single women, any unmarried woman would be also forcibly aborted. And I've met with several myself, both in China and others here, part of the diaspora, some of the lucky ones who got refugee status. And I'm just wondering, what is the status of that now? Can an unwed mother continue her pregnancy to term?
Thank you for that question. Insofar as the status of unwed mothers in China and their difficulties obtaining all sorts of reproductive services, and it can be both in the direction. Now, previously in the past, abortions have been quite easily obtained in China. We both, of course, know many people who have used it actually as a form of contraception. Now that appears to be reversing now because of the Chinese government's stance to encourage births, at least among the Han population. Like I said, last month, there were new regulations that appeared to be winding that back insofar as giving abortion services for unmarried women and adolescent women. Now, in either of these cases, what it amounts to is coercion and a limitation on women's choices, and that is never a good thing. And as to your question on human rights groups and what they have said, I think in principle, human rights groups are all about the opposition of force, the opposition of forcing a woman to have a child, the opposition of forcing a woman to have sex, the opposition of forcing women in general. Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate that so much. And again, we do have a fundamental disagreement on the unborn child. I think they are worthy of protection. And, I've
Thank
met
you,
with a number of-
Congressman. We are,
I'll just finish up real quick, if
Thank
you don't
you.
mind, Mr. Chairman. A number of women who are post-abortive and wish that someone would have said, that much agony often follows her who's had an abortion. It's all about, reconciliation and hoping that they can get back on their lives. But it is a tragic loss of life. So thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Congresswoman Steele.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all the witnesses coming out today, and I'm just so grateful. I think it's appalling that the CCP refuses to call Russia's recent actions an invasion, and it is also appalling that Chairman Xi Jinping is standing with Putin. Add this to long list of actions by CCP to cheat and abuse the global rules-based system, and another example of their human rights atrocities. As we speak, the CCP still limit women's access to leadership positions and is virtually run and controlled by men. The CCP steals large volumes of information and censors its own people and information. The recent video of a chained mother of 8 and the censorship of those who posted about it in China and sought additional information is horrific examples of the CCP's ongoing abuse of its citizens. A study by Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health and the Kachin Women's Association Thailand estimated that about 21,000 women and girls from northern Myanmar were forced into marriage in just one province in China from 2013 to 2017. The United States must stand and fight for the women and girls of China who are being oppressed and prosecuted by CCP. Women should not be prosecuted for speaking out against human rights abuses. Having said that, to all the witnesses, anybody wants to answer, please help me to answer this. My first question is, China's labor force is declining. Decades-long birth policies that we've been talking about today, and its aging politician will weigh on its economy. The CCP allows for gender inequality in education and health. What can the United States and major companies to give these women voices and equality? And any witnesses?
Hello. I'll take a first stab at that. One of my great frustrations in just observing the international response to abuses by the Chinese government is that all of these multinational corporations seem to only be thinking about their bottom line. And so I don't know what the US government can do to affect the stance of these kinds of corporations or international organizations like the International Olympic Committee, for example, perhaps go through the United Nations. But of course, the US government can come up with certain policies, perhaps sanctions, but I see those as having somewhat limited impact when you have so many American corporations that simply don't care about doing the right thing? So this is a very tricky question. And I don't know who else wants to jump in.
Actually, I sent a letter out with 17 other Congress members during, right before the Olympic, asked all these corporations, they're spending billions of dollars on advertising, and I asked them to spend just a little bit more, let whole world know that human rights violation in China, that's what's happening. And I didn't get any responses from these 17 corporations. I was very, very disappointed. So if anybody wants to answer, that's good. But I can go into.
I can jump into one here very
Okay.
briefly here. I think this is one possibility of a sort of a very simple request and possibly doable. U.S. companies do a lot of business in China, as we know. U.S. companies partner with Chinese companies. I think one good ask is to ask them to stop participating in these discriminatory workplace practices against women in China, who make up quite a significant amount of their workforce and their employees, either by contract or through their partnerships. That is something that we can ask and we can push for. That I think that that would make sense for U.S. companies. Ask that.
Thank you. Thank you for that answer. And my second question is, after the events of tennis star Peng Shuai's waiver, Chinese women must be more fearful than ever about speaking out against the abuses. What is moral and day-to-day life in long-term moral for women in China? And what is moral and day-to-day life and long-term moral for women in China?
Demek onun hazırkı sualыңlarga cevap bergin ba. Men
I would like to answer your previous question. I'm sorry, I was a bit late.
ulamdı.
Go ahead. Thank you.
Nimo hazır biz bolup mecburi emgekке bizning Uyg'urlarning aşı lagerdan ip ketip atganda men aş öz gözüm bilen kögen bolup hazır davamlaşıp atıdı. Mening Amerika hökümetiga daýdyganym çokum şunu birinci toktutiş gerek. Fakat hazır çıkarıp koyan kanunny hiç kaçan Xitay onu ilik ağını yok, hiç kaçan toktatkyny yok, yanıl davamlaştırıp atıdı. Men işini Amerika hökümeti onu çokum toktutalaydı. Bir işten onu men bugün şunu diýim ba, Amerika hökümetiga hazır 6 yıl boldy biz kakşabatymyz, dabatymyz. Çokum biz üçün haqiqi bir iş kılışыңlarını ümit kılmayın. Çünkü kolonlardan kelidi. Öz vaqtida sizler Avrabiya kadrini qutuldurup çıktыңlar şu yerden. Şuňaşqa bütün Uygurlar bilidi sizlerning bu ýerde kolonlardan bir haqiqi Xitayga bir işni kılalaydygyňlarga, ularga küçüňlarni ýetip sizler şu çagda men hazır 6 ýylyň ýakymyny buwatgan kırgınçylykny Xitay toktutup koyguny yok. Sizlerni dawatgan kanunlaryny hiç kaçan o ýana ilik olmaýatydy, qygylygyny qywatydy, ýana mejburi emgekke işletip atydy. Uygurlarni yana okşaşlyk kırgınçylyk kılıp atydy. Şuning üçin sizler ämeli bir iş kılışыңlarny ümit kılma. Amerika hökümetiga men hayran qypatma. Ya qygyňlar kelmeýip atamdy. Men bäzi şunu oýlapma kalma. Ya küçüňler ýetip turup kılmaýap atkandagly his kıp kalma bäzi. Ras men özüm şahsy bir özümniň muş pikirim. Kalamga bäzi aşdy kildi. Men Xitayda tuğa wagtymda aşda oýlaýdym. Çünkü Amerikanyň kançylyk güçlükligini bilmez bilidi bütün Uygurlar. Çünkü sizler öz wagtda aşdy Abiýanyň kadryny qutulduryňlar, Kazakstanda meni qutuldurup keldiň, kançylyk adamlaryny qutuldurup atysda. Sizler kişilik hukukda birinci orunda tursizler.
I just would like to answer the previous question. The forced labor issue, the forced labor in Uyghur region is still continuing. Many the detainees from the camps, concentration camps, now move it to factories to work as a cheap labor. So it is still continuing. I really wish that U.S. government do something to stop it, implement the End Forced Labor Policy Act, and just to do take practical action. I believe the power of America because the Uyghurs are really believe in the power, the ability that America can do. We deeply believe in because previously the U.S. government were able to save Ms. Rabia Kadir from jail and brought her to America, and the later person like myself, I was saved by the America as well, and I was able to live from the concentration camps, and through Kazakhstan, I came to the United States as well. All of the Uyghur people are deeply believe in if American government wants to do something, they are able to do so. So that's our hope. I mean, sometimes I really think that it's been 6 years that we've been talking about the genocide is happening in Uyghur region, and we keep talking about it's already there. And just the personal hope, that personal wish, the Americas should take action and stop the genocide and stop the forced labor in Uyghur region.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, my time is up. Or do you think I can hear for the second question?
Thank you very much, Congresswoman. We do have 2 more members of Congress waiting, and so I think we should proceed and then come back to you if you're able to stay with us for a second round.
Thank you. Then,
And I'll now recognize Senator Ossoff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our panel for your powerful testimony today. Ms. Ziauddin, thank you for your courage and your testimony and for sharing your experiences. I'd like to ask you, what about the systematic mistreatment of women in detention camps in Xinjiang does the U.S. Congress need to know that you've not yet had the opportunity to share today?
Ziyadan Hanım, sizden soraydı. Sizin cesaretinize köp rahmet. Şu nemeniki Uyghur ayallarınki ceza lagerlarda sistemalı halda aşında nemige nahaq muamele uçurışı, sistemalı müştak nahaq uçurışı müşahda sizinki burun demegen şu kongres bizim bilişimiz tegishlik degan deydigan gaplarınız barmı? Şu sistemalı noto'g'ri muamele uçuraş ceza lagerlarda.
Оныңға мен өзім ұшырған, кейінімді еш қандай той қылмаған қызларның мәжбүри туылмас операциясы қылғандарын өз көзім білен көрдім. 20 яшлық қызлар. Әтті 22 яш, 21 яшлық бір қыз мен білен бір қатар басқыншылық ұшырғанын өз көзім білен көрдім. Сараң болып қалғанlar оның ішінде. Әтті өліп кеткен қансырап баласын туылмас операция қылып еткен жағда көz алдымда өліп кетті. Şunu gördüm bana. Onun için ayarlar boğan neresine desem değiştim kokum hemen.
The mistreatment that women face at the concentration intimate camps is extreme, and sometimes I don't really wish to think about it, or it's just really scary. I am one of the witness to those mistreatments. I personally have witnessed that a 21 years old girl was raped, and also some unmarried girls were sterilized, and some women were died from bleeding. I have witnessed all this. The mistreatment towards a Uyghur woman is very systematic. It's very popular, and it's always there. So it's just horrifying to think about it.
Hatta toy qılmаған қыз дейді. Toy qılmаған қыз, мен toy qılmadım, тек бал туғмадым, toy қылмасам, қандақ менің бал ятқанын операция қылсынlar деп жығылап кеткен оны.
One unmarried girl was pleading, saying that, look, I have not even got married yet. Why would you do operation onto my uterus?
Ms. Ziauddin, thank you for your courageous testimony and for establishing for the historical record and for the information of the U.S. Congress your testimony with respect to these ongoing atrocities. With my brief remaining time, I would humbly invite you to make any comments that you believe should be heard by the broader American public, by the American people.
Sizdeki cesaretinize değen şahitliğinizge köp rahmet. Siz özünüzün Amerika halkıga, Amerika hükümetiga özünüzün uçuq aşkarmışlar. Göz qarşınız barmanda deydigan sözünüz barmı?
Göz qarşım var. Men Amerika hükümeti deydiganim yanılı şu gap sizler bir haqiqiy bizga egi chiqqanlar cho'qim hazır Kişilik hukuk degenden minçilik ayallarniki mana biz ayallarning faqatmi yo'q ku hozir Xi Jinpingning qilayotgani ochiq oshkoralik kişilik hukuk degan depsandi qilyotdi. Nima uchun shuning o'zidan o'zi nima uchun bunda qonun hurmat qilmaysa deb demaydigini hayron dis bu munda cho'qim hurmat qil dunyoda hozir qanchalik bo'lib ketib qolgan qar yo'q yana o'z bilganini qilyotdi. Shunga Amerika hukumati haqiqiy Xitoy hukumatiga cho'qim bir ish qilishini umid qilma bir nima deyishini bizning bunda depsandi bo'lib ayollarning huquqi butun bolalarning hammasining huquqini depsandi qilayotgan bir davlatning bu dunyoda mavjud bo'lishini cho'qim kishilik huquqni bunda hurmat qilmaydigan unda kommunist partiyaning bu dunyoda yo'q bo'lib ketishini qalayman. Shuni deyishini ochiq oshkor o'ziga Xitoy hukumatining amaliy bir ish qilishini umid qilman. Amerika hukumati qila oladi deb qilmayapsizlar, lekin qilinglar, o'tinib qilay. Kishilik huquq maktabsandi bo'lyapti hozir. Nima uchun qarab turyapsizlar? Yana o'xshash qilyapti yana.
I am begging to American government to take action. Please do more. The human rights violations are the common in China. And China's Communist Party is doing whatever they want to do, despite world's pressure and just by world watching it. But I really wish that if American government wish to and if take action, just to take action, do more, because we believe that you can do more.
Axırda aytdığım men bir gap, men lagerda bizga mundaq aytdi. Aşı bir gap isim keldi. Biz dünyada yani çık bolsa 5 yıl 10 yıl qamay biz faqat bir jungo degan narsalar bo'ldi va hammasini biz dunyoni bir jungo qilamiz. Hech qachon biz Amerikadan qo'rqib qolmaysizlar, ishinib ketmanglar, Amerikada Uyqurlarni tutib kelamiz, Rabiya Qadirni tutib keldik, biz o'lg'ilyapti, hozir qamab qo'ydik deb ashta degan. Shuni o'ylab qolmayapsiz, rost qo'rqyapsizlarki jungodan deb. Men lekin u yerda biz sizlarni bek kuchlik deb o'ylaydi hammadan. Hozirmi shundoq o'ylayman men nazarimda. Yani nimaga shundoq qilyapsizlar, men aqlim ayron shu ochiq. U yerda ashta deb deydi, ya shundoq qarab turib shuni bir jungo qilib butun hammanglar jungoga bo'ysunishinglar kerakmi? Shundoq qilamizlar, shundoq qilishni xohlayapsizlar bilmayman men. Yani hamma yerda Xitoyning kommunist partiyaning digini degan bo'lyapti, Xi Jinpinglar diginini qilyapti. Hech kim uning narsasini to'xtatamayotgani hayron. Mana olimpikmi bo'lib ketdi, yani hech kim qilmadinglar. Men shuni mayli meni jazolasalar, men baribir o'lib bo'lgan odam, men xato gap qilib qo'ysam bu yerda bugun nimishga men bir adib puhra o'qimagan, yana 8-sinf o'qigan bir ayol, shunga bu yerda siyosatni bilmay gap qilib qo'yapman, lekin ichimdan qaynayotgan narsani deyapman. Men kechiringlar, xato gap qilib qo'ysam, sizlar hech kim qilmayapsizlar. Xi Jinpingning deginlik bo'lyapti jahonda yana hozir.
To me, while I was in the camp, the camp officials told us that within 5 years, the world can be controlled by China. I mean, I don't know whether the America's scaring from China is nothing practical or nothing action is happening right now. But however, people really believe that America is very strong. I am really sorry if I am saying something wrong because I'm not really well-educated person, but I don't know how politics works. But I am just as an ordinary woman, I am just speaking out what came to my mind from what I have witnessed and what I have been through. Yes, the world is doing something, but the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government is still able to do whatever they want to do. Like, for example, we tried to stop the Olympic to happen, but it happened. And we tried to stop many things to happen and stop China's violation against Uyghur people, but it's still happening. So just my question, sometimes I was wonder whether world or America is fearful from the China. And just as Chinese Communist Party said, the world will follow and obey us whatever we do. So I really wish to see action by the American government and by the people.
Mına milyonlagan xalqimiz yetib atgan türmelerde hech qanday gunohsiz sababsiz balchaqsini arılıb atqanlar. Bunundan milyonlagan Uyg'urlar yetib atadi hozir. Nima uchun yana qarab turibdi?
Yeah, there are millions of people are still in the detentions. I don't know why world is still watching that what's happening there. Look, those kind of people, they are just among the millions who separate from the family members and still.
Kechiringlar, shunda meni xato gap qilib qo'ysam kechiringlar. Hammanglarning maqsadi ya biroqlar bizni o'lsin Xitoyning qo'lida qarab turamiz, mayli o'lib ketsin deb xohlamsizlar deb o'ylab qolmaymiz.
I'm really sorry if I'm saying something wrong, Sometimes I just think, are you just looking that we be just disappeared from the earth?
Cinayetçi çokum cazasını tartış gerek kanun aldı dep oylayman şunun üçün. Bilmeyme. Hazır men ümitim üzülüp ketdi. Ölümden başka narsa hazır dünyaga bolgan ümitim üzülüp ketdi ras.
Sometimes I lost my hope from the world. I don't know what's happening. I just wish to see some action, and I don't wish my people to disappear.
Ms. Ziauddin, your testimony today will steel the resolve of the United States and the world to confront these crimes against humanity. And please know that your testimony has been full of courage and that the Congress, the American people, and the world are grateful to you and full of respect and admiration for you for speaking out, even at personal risk and risk to your family, and for sharing your experiences and the experiences of your people with us. I thank you for your testimony. I ask humbly that the interpreter relay this message to the witness prior to returning the microphone to the chair. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Köpten köp rahmat deydicu, şu Amerika hükümeti hemisi sizin şu cesaret bilen degan şu şahitligimizni bizim elbet anlaymiz. Biz anlaymiz, sizni anlaymiz.
Rahmat.
Hükümet anlaydı. Şu haqida biz özümüzün tedbirini aldık. Sizga yana cesaretiniz.
Rahmat sizlarga artık gap qilib qo'ysam kechiringlar meni men. Biraz chidab bolaman.
Thank you very much for giving the opportunity. I'm really sorry. I got really emotional.
Thank you so much for your passionate testimony, and it makes a difference to have your voice heard, which is exactly why we invited you to join us in this hearing today. Many of us here on this commission, all of us on this commission, are fighting to draw attention to human rights issues in China, and certainly today to focus on the treatment of women, and you've added a great deal to that conversation. So, and the challenges that face us in trying to change the situation. I will now defer to Congresswoman Wexton, who I believe is awaiting to join us.
Very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much. I also want to applaud the brave women of China who are speaking out against harassment, violence, and discrimination. Ms. Tersanet, especially you. I know that it's extremely difficult to have to relive all of the horror that you went through in the camps and every time you come and testify here on the Hill, but it makes a huge difference, and I just want to say thank you so much for everything that you do. We all know the story of Peng Shuai. I was honored to lead the resolution in support of Peng, which passed the House unanimously. Her story rightly got a lot of attention, but that's because she's a famous athlete with very famous friends who worried about her. And for every Peng Shuai, there are thousands of others who have been disappeared, charged with crimes, and trolled online for speaking out. I want to use some of my time to talk about a woman who is currently serving a life sentence in China, Gulmira Emin. Gulmira and her story were brought to my attention by the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission. Gulmira is a Uyghur Muslim who served as a government employee. She was arrested in 2009 after authorities alleged she had organized a protest and leaked state secrets to her husband in Norway. Her family was never notified of her arrest and didn't even know where she was being held until they saw her in a Chinese documentary dressed in prison garb. In 2010, Gulmira was sentenced to life in prison after being tortured and forced to sign a confession. She was not allowed to meet with her lawyer until her actual trial date, and her appeal was rejected. She's being held in Xinjiang Women's Prison and is allowed one family visit every 3 months. And as shocking and heartbreaking as Gulmira's story, it is far from unique. I've heard dozens of similar accounts from people in the Uyghur diaspora just outside of Washington, D.C. and Northern Virginia, where I represent. And Ms. Tersanet, assalamu alaikum. It's wonderful to see you again.
Assalamu alaikum. Wa alaikum salam.
I do want to thank you again for sharing your heartbreaking story. I'm so glad that you feel safe now enough to actually come out and tell your story and share it because it's so compelling and it's so important. Now, you talked a little bit in your testimony about the need for the U.S. to accept more Uyghur refugees because even if they make it out of China, they occasionally are at risk of being sent back to China to face charges if they're in a neighboring country. Can you speak a little bit more about that, please?
Немдейдичи сиз азыр өзүңүздүн немиси дедиңизго маселен немдеги Американын жакарак нем кылыш не болмуштак саясий канат деген аштак көчмөнлөргө шуларга жардам кылыш мушакларды сиз өзүңүздүн немисин отур койдуңуз дейт. Мушак көп бир аз сөзлөп дамсыз дейди бир аз şu жакта.
Мәсәлән, Америкага кәгелем азыр bir жылдан ашты, 1,5 жыл булай деп калды. Мен нургын кишиләрне атрапымда көдүм, уйгырларның ашу тараптан кыйналып атканны, мәсәлән, аш иш битмәгән, мәсәлән, кагызы чыкмаса бер ярларда эшләш өчен бак кыйналды икән, һәм балаларны укытыш өчен кыйналып атканларны, шундый нургын адамлар, аиләсе бер я киләмәй аткан, мәсәлән, аш Мехригул Qarindishimiz Mehrigul lagerdan chiqqan Mehrigulning aşı bitmegəşkə yolduşun əkilenməy iki balası bilan qıyınılıb atıdı, aşının oxşaş. Məsələn, şularını görüb, mən jiq aştaq atrapımda Uyğurlarını urğun köydüm. Şoňşyk bu digim kep qaldı. Ular üçün bəziləri əndiş qılıb, ətaqtay bizni qaytadan əkitəmi, bizning qağızımız çıxmagan diken bəlkім tutub ketə, əkitə degan əndişmi bak ya. Bu yerdə ondaq bolmaslığı eniq oğlum əndişlərdən hərgiz bu dövlət kep ondaq qılamaydı. Lekin şunu odama aştaq əndişlər bak.
Regarding the refugees or asylum seekers, personally, I have came to United States. It's been about a year now, and also I have witnessed other Uyghur people in the community who has problems in having proper status in America. For example, because of many Uyghurs, they don't have proper status in America. They are unable to give the children to study in the higher education system, and also many families they are unable to reunite because they don't have good enough status, so they are unable to sponsor or bring back other family members that lives in other countries. And for example, there is one person, my friend Mehrigul Tursun, who is another camp survivor, and she's unable to reunite with her husband because of her status. And even some people, although I don't believe that U.S. government will deport any Uyghurs back to China, but still some people fear of deportation back to China.
And I know that that's something that's happening in other countries, so that's very concerning to me. And that's why I have a bipartisan bill with Vice Chairman Chris Smith and also with Representative Deutsch that would grant Uyghurs P2 refugee status here in the U.S., which would essentially expedite their ability to apply for asylum here in the U.S. Now, I have people on my caseload here who have been in the process of trying to clarify their status and get asylum here in the U.S. for over 8-10 years. And so, it's really, really sad that it's taking them so long to get their status and to have that kind of safety feeling. Now, it's very important that this legislation pass. It was rolled into the America Competes Act, but I'm hoping that the Senate will make sure that it stays in there in the final version of this legislation. So Chairman Merkley, I'm asking you please to make it a priority of yours to make sure that this legislation ends up in the final version of whatever bill comes out through the conference process, and that we have those P2 refugee status for our Uyghur folks who have fled China. And that's all. With that, I will yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, and I certainly support that effort completely, and thank you for being such an advocate for it in the House. I did want to pause and see if Congresswoman Steele was still with us and wanted to ask her second question. And if we determine that she is with us, I will turn to her. Otherwise, we have no other members of Congress who are waiting, but I'm going to ask a couple of final questions. I wanted to address specifically, Mr. Halegua. You described the law on the protection of women's rights and interests, and then noted that very few people, very few women actually file cases involving harassment or abuse. And I think you cited 6 out of 83 cases, or if I got the number right. And that if they do file, they are subject to retaliation and countersuits regarding defamation. And so the system is completely rigged and against them. And certainly the message that has been sent by the treatment of Peng Shui seems to reinforce that the Chinese government is saying you will be silent when you are abused, and if you speak out, you will suffer for doing so. Is that the message the Chinese government is sending?
Thank you for the question, Senator. Yes, I believe that there certainly, at least in these high-profile cases, certainly a mixed message at best. You know, on the one hand, the Chinese government is passing laws and encouraging women, to come forward and complain about sexual harassment, but then we see these other acts. There was one case involving an intern from CCTV that received a lot of attention. She goes by the name Shenze. And years after she had completed her internship, she posted something online about a TV news anchor who had sexually harassed her during the time. And one of the interesting parts of her account was, after she did so, eventually she was, her parents, were contacted, and according to her, the police or the other authorities had sort of intimidated her and tried to suggest that if she went forward and continued with her complaint or went forward with her court case, that there would be some repercussions for her parents. So this type of behavior, obviously, is just one more reason that makes it quite the uphill battle for women who have been victims of sexual harassment, making that decision of whether to complain or whether to come forward. And I think that is the problem, right? The calculus. A system that largely relies upon victims being willing to come forward, being willing to talk about what happened, and talk about who they've been harassed by. There's already a lot of reasons to not take those steps, and if we keep piling on the reasons and making it less attractive, it's hard to see a path towards really getting at improving the situation around sexual harassment.
Thank you. I now want to turn to the question that has been mentioned a few times, which is the potential role of U.S. companies operating in China. One can imagine that these companies, these U.S. companies, would say, hey, there's very capable and talented women who can strengthen our operations here, and perhaps they're being ignored by Chinese companies. We will want to certainly give them an opportunity to come and strengthen our efforts. But do we see U.S. businesses really, that are operating in China, really reaching out to promote the hiring of Chinese women and giving them opportunities of leadership and management that they might be denied in many Chinese companies? And I don't know, Ms. Fong, if you want to start with that conversation, or Dr. Hong Fisher.
Thank you for the question. I believe U.S. companies want to hire the best people, but they also want to be, they also want to work with their Chinese companies, and they want to have an easy time, and they also want to work with their Chinese authorities. So it's a question of which one is balanced out and which one is. So I think the U.S. government has a role in incentivizing U.S. companies to do the right thing with regards to their workforce and gender equality for women. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. I would just echo, American companies, really are in China in two roles, right? Many of them are employers, right, have their own operations there. And so I think to the extent that they can be, you know, sort of ahead of the curve in complying not only with Chinese law, but implementing practices, for instance, around sexual harassment, even though the Chinese law is quite weak in terms of any consequences if you don't live up to what the regulations demand, there's no reason that American companies can't be instituting the same types of anti-sexual harassment programs in terms of policies, trainings, complaint mechanisms, investigations that we would expect them to implement here in the United States. The other role that they play is as, you know, purchasers of goods and services. And we've already seen in a lot of instances where, at least through codes of conduct and auditing, I'm not suggesting that those have always been particularly effective, but the mechanisms are there for U.S. companies doing business to place requirements on their Chinese suppliers, or in a more positive light, work with their Chinese suppliers to make sure that they are doing the types of trainings and have the right types of policies and mechanisms, even to live up to the Chinese law, right? So even if the Chinese government won't be active in enforcing its own regulations, there's no reasons that U.S. companies can't insist that the people that they buy goods and services from are living up to the letter of the Chinese law.
Well, Mr. Halegua, so there's no reason not to expect U.S. companies to abide by the same standards they might operate in the U.S. But the question is, are they? Are there examples of U.S. companies that have instituted very strong programs that fire individuals who harass others within their companies, that really make a point about putting talented women into positions of responsibility? Or are we finding that the U.S. companies feel that this is disruptive to the cultural dominance of men, or disturbing to their Chinese partners? Are they, in other words, where are they coming out in this balance? Are U.S. companies leading the way, or are they holding back?
I think my knowledge of it is somewhat anecdotal, and mostly from, you know, we've definitely seen cases of, you know, I know McDonald's had a pretty well-publicized case of taking action against someone who engaged in sexual harassment. You know, lawyers who I talked to that work with U.S. companies operating in China seem to say that they are at the, I would say, doing better than most of their Chinese counterparts because of the experience that they have in the United States. And I think that they actually find it difficult, you know, if you are going to have global policies for a company, it would be hard to sort of carve out China and make a different set of rules. And so I think that while it's hard to generalize, you do see a lot of companies that are performing better in these areas.
And Dr. Hongfincher?
Well, this isn't really something that I pay close attention to, but just based on my experience in China, I would say that a lot of American companies just want to play by Chinese rules. And so you have the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, even that may not be followed in many cases. But this is a real problem because there is, for example, this widespread culture of business drinking where it is quite routine to bring young women and to ply them with alcohol. And there have been many cases where these young women are then raped, and the rapists just get away with it. And I believe that the cases that we know about are Chinese companies, or maybe lower level Chinese government officials, or in the case of Peng Shuai, that she actually accused one of the most powerful men in China of sexually assaulting her. But I would believe, based on all of the other research that I've done, that this kind of thing happens a lot more than we hear about. And I know that there are some American companies that do not do as much as they should to protect the rights of women, even within their own companies, because they're protecting their own reputation as their own brand at their company.
Thank you. I think it's just important for us to keep raising this issue of what U.S. companies can do in a proactive way. And finally, I want to turn, Dr. Hung Fincher, to your testimony and just put a spotlight on it, that the Chinese government is encouraging births among the Han Chinese. At the same time, it is engaging in policies that are seeking to stop our Uyghur and other minorities from having children through sterilization, through re-education camps, through forced labor camps, and so forth. And so this, is there any other way to describe this than as racist eugenics?
Well, thank you for your question, Chairman Merkley. This is certainly a practice of eugenics and genocide. If you define genocide in part by a deliberate attempt to reduce births of a certain ethnic minority and to separate the children of that ethnic minority, because that is also happening. The children of Uyghur and other Turkic Muslims are being separated from their parents. Something that hasn't come up in this hearing is also this strong coercive element of inter-ethnic marriages where Uyghur women are pushed to marry Han Chinese men. There are a lot of benefits to inter-ethnic couples, and that, in my view, is also a deliberate attempt to kind of also dilute the Uyghur population. And on the flip side, it's all part of the Chinese government's attempt to engineer a particular quote unquote high quality population. So it's not just about falling birth rates overall, because the Chinese government wants birth rates to fall, and it is making them fall among the Uyghur, Kazakh, and other Turkic Muslim populations. There's so much evidence proving that the mass campaigns of forced sterilizations among these populations. And it is just a stark turnaround in population planning policy that the Chinese government went from this draconian one-child policy to now a three-child policy. So far, we don't see extremely coercive elements of this three-child policy, but I am concerned, as Ms. Fong mentioned, it is much more difficult for men to obtain vasectomies. I am concerned about perhaps a nationwide effort to restrict abortion access for women, Han Chinese women, to try to force them or coerce them into having more children when they don't want those children. And it is all related to the government's view that women are reproductive tools of the Chinese state. They are agents of the Chinese government's development goals. And so in the past, the goal was to limit births. And so there were forced sterilizations, forced abortions among millions and millions of Han Chinese women. And now those very coercive practices are limited primarily to Uyghur and Turkic populations. And it's the opposite, very pro-natalist for the Han Chinese population. And by the way, the Chinese feminist activists are almost all from this cohort of Han Chinese, very educated women. And if I may add, this is another reason that the Chinese government perceives the feminist movement to be such a threat, is because how do they get rid of this movement? It would be very difficult for them to just jail all of the feminist activists, because at the same time, the government is trying to cajole Han Chinese college-educated women into having more children, into getting married and having more children. And so this is one of the key reasons that the feminist movement is so very complicated for the Chinese government to deal with.
Thank you. And you did raise a point that I had not heard before about incentives for Uyghur women to marry Han men. What kind of incentives are you talking about?
Well, there are bonuses, for example, housing benefits, or even cash bonuses offered to couples that are marrying, where it's been one member of the marriage is Han Chinese and the other is ethnic Uyghur. And that is, it's a long-standing effort. It's been going on for several years. And then the children in that marriage would be raised according to Han Chinese customs.
Thank you very much. And thank you to each and every one of you for your testimony today to shine a light on these incredibly important issues regarding the treatment of women in China and more broadly practices that need to be illuminated and understood by the world. Hopefully, in drawing attention to them, we create a process where more is done to counter these policies, to end these practices. So your voices are very important in moving the members of Congress and the world to address these issues. We will keep the record open until the close of business on Friday, March 4th, for any items that members would like to submit for the record, or if they have additional questions that they would like to ask for our witnesses. And with that, our hearing is adjourned.